I was leaning against my Subaru in the Canyon Ridge Commons Association parking lot, watching a folding table get treated like a felony, when I realized the HOA vice president had finally lost her mind. The table was 2 feet wide, held a thermos of hot cocoa and some paper cups, and I had set it up 20 minutes earlier so neighbors could grab a warm drink while we all shoveled the overnight snow. Fishers, Indiana does not mess around with lake-effect dumps, and this one had left 8 inches across every driveway in our lakefront community. I had moved here 6 months ago because the rent was reasonable and the lake views were supposed to be peaceful, but the HOA turned out to be a nightmare factory run by people who treated dock assignments and sightlines like nuclear codes. I work as a rideshare fleet coordinator, scheduling drivers and vehicles all day, and I had been saving every spare dollar for a down payment on my own place so I could get out of this rental circus. The first sign of trouble had been a complaint about my snow brush 3 weeks earlier, when Carol Rutherford, the vice president everyone called Brenda behind her back, told me I could not leave personal property on my car overnight. The snow brush. On my car. In winter. Now she was standing in front of my folding table with her phone out, taking pictures like I had erected a stage for a rock concert. Carol was a middle-aged woman with black shoulder-length wavy hair, a black puffer coat, and a burgundy knit beanie pulled low over her forehead. She had the kind of voice that carried across a parking lot even when she was trying to whisper, and right now she was not whispering. "This is an unapproved event setup," she said. "You did not submit a request form for common area use." "It is a folding table," I said, "with cocoa. For people shoveling snow." "It is an unauthorized structure in a common area," Carol said. "The rules are very clear." "I have been on this board for years. I know what I am doing," she added, her voice rising. "You cannot set up furniture without written approval 72 hours in advance." I looked at the table. I looked at the thermos. I looked at Carol, who was now circling the setup like a health inspector at a failed restaurant. "This is not furniture," I said. "This is a card table. It folds up. I will put it away in 10 minutes. "The damage is already done," Carol said. "I am documenting this for the board meeting." She took another photo, then walked back toward the clubhouse without another word. I stood there, holding my shovel, watching her boots crunch through the snow, and felt the first cold edge of real trouble settle in my chest. I had to be on the road before the next round of freezing rain hit, because my fleet had 3 drivers out sick and I needed to cover a late shift myself. I did not have time for HOA theater. But Carol Rutherford did not operate on normal person time. She operated on power trip time, and that meant everything moved at the speed of punishment. 2 days later, I found an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a cure letter, dated 4 days earlier, informing me that I had violated Canyon Ridge Commons Association Rule 14.3 regarding unauthorized event setups, and that I had failed to cure the violation within the required 72-hour window. The letter said I now owed a $200 fine plus $50 per day until the violation was corrected. I read it twice, then checked the date again. The letter claimed it had been mailed on the day before I even set up the table. It was backdated. Carol had written the violation notice, predated it, and then used the fake timeline to claim I had missed a deadline that never existed. I called the management company that afternoon. The supervisor, a man named Greg, listened to my explanation and then put me on hold for 6 minutes. When he came back, he sounded tired. "Carol submitted the violation on the day you set up the table," he said. "The date on the letter is a clerical error. I can update the file to reflect the correct timeline, but the fine is still active because you did not submit a common area request form." "The table was up for 10 minutes, I said. "It was not an event. It was cocoa during shoveling." "The board considers any temporary structure in a common area to be an event setup," Greg said. "I do not make the rules. I just enforce them." "Who voted on that interpretation?" I asked. "The board has standing authority to interpret the rules," Greg said. "If you want to dispute the fine, you need to request a hearing at the next board meeting." "When is that?" I asked. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, the $50 per day penalty would add another $1,000 to a fine that started at $200. I did not have that kind of money to burn. I was saving for a down payment, and every dollar the HOA took was a dollar further from getting out of Canyon Ridge Commons. I told Greg I would be at the meeting, then hung up and started looking for help. I needed someone who understood how HOA enforcement actually worked, and I needed them fast. I remembered a tip line staffer from the local news station who had covered a story about another neighborhood association scandal a few months earlier. I found his contact info online and sent him an email explaining the situation. He wrote back an hour later with 2 sentences that changed everything. Get the board meeting minutes from the last 6 months. If they never voted on the event setup interpretation, the fine is unenforceable. I filed a records request with the management company that same afternoon. Greg called me the next morning and told me the records would cost me $75 in copy fees, payable in advance. I asked why digital records required copy fees. He said the HOA had a right to recover administrative costs. I said I would pay it if he could show me the board resolution authorizing the fee structure. He put me on hold again. When he came back, he said he would check with Carol and get back to me. He did not get back to me. Instead, 2 days later, I got another letter. This one said my records request had been denied pending payment of outstanding fines. The HOA was holding my access to evidence hostage unless I paid the bogus fees first. It was retaliatory records denial, and it was exactly the kind of move that looked clean on paper but was rotten underneath. I kept my hands open and my voice calm, because the real move was still ahead. I could not get the records through the management company, but Indiana has open meeting laws, and board meetings are required to keep minutes. If Carol had been blocking access, that meant the minutes probably showed something she did not want me to see. I needed another route to those records, and I needed someone who had already been through this fight. I reached out to a neighbor, a man named Paul, who had lived in Canyon Ridge for 8 years and had been complaining about dock reassignments since the day I moved in. Paul was out of town for holiday travel, visiting family in Ohio. But he texted me back within an hour and told me he had copies of the last 2 years of board minutes in a binder in his garage. He said I could grab them any time, and he gave me his garage code. I went over that evening, found the binder on a shelf next to a stack of old paint cans, and took it home. The minutes were a goldmine. In the last 6 months, the board had voted on new landscaping contracts, new mailbox paint colors, and new rules about holiday decorations. But there was no vote, no discussion, and no mention of any event setup interpretation. The rule about common area requests had been on the books for years, but it had always applied to things like weddings, garage sales, and block parties. Nobody had ever defined a folding table with cocoa as an event. Carol had made up the interpretation herself, applied it retroactively, and then backdated the enforcement letter to make it look like I had ignored a deadline. I took photos of every page. Then I sent the whole set to the news tip line staffer and asked him what I should do next. He wrote back with one word: complain. He meant file a formal complaint, and he told me exactly where to send it. Indiana has a consumer protection division that handles HOA disputes, and if I could show the board was retaliating and blocking records access, they would investigate. I spent the next 2 hours drafting a complaint that laid out the backdated letter, the records denial, the escalating fines, and the lack of any board vote authorizing the event setup rule. I attached the meeting minutes photos, highlighted the dates, and submitted the complaint through the state website. The confirmation email said I should expect a response within 10 business days. I did not have 10 business days. The freezing rain was forecast to hit again in 36 hours, and I needed to get my car out of the neighborhood before the roads turned into skating rinks. But the morning after I filed the complaint, I woke up to find my driveway blocked. Carol had placed 4 orange traffic cones across the entrance to my driveway, spacing them close enough that I could not pull out without moving them first. A laminated note was zip-tied to the center cone. The note said the driveway was under review for snow removal compliance and that I should contact the management company before moving my vehicle. I stood there in my tan wool coat and dark green beanie, staring at the cones, and felt my patience finally run out. This was not enforcement. This was harassment. Carol was using HOA rules like a weapon, and she was escalating every time I pushed back. I pulled out my phone and called Greg at the management company. He did not pick up. I left a voicemail asking him to explain why my driveway was blocked and who authorized the cones. Then I took photos of the whole setup, the cones, the note, the position across my driveway, and sent them to the news tip line staffer with a single sentence. "She is trying to trap my car." He wrote back 5 minutes later. "Move the cones. Document everything. If she calls it tampering, you have photos proving she blocked your legal access." I moved the cones to the curb, got in my Subaru, and left for work. I was halfway through my shift when Greg finally called me back. He said Carol had reported me for removing HOA safety equipment without authorization and that the board was considering an additional fine for tampering. I asked him what safety equipment meant. He said the cones were marking a hazard area. I asked him what the hazard was. He said he would have to check with Carol. That night, I got another letter. This one was not taped to my door. It was sitting on my windshield under the wiper blade, held in place by my snow brush. Carol had taken my snow brush from my car again, used it to pin the letter, and left both items on the windshield like a calling card. The letter said I was now being fined an additional $300 for removing safety equipment and interfering with HOA operations. It also said my parking privileges were under review, and that I might be required to park on the street until the review was complete. The snow brush. She kept coming back to the snow brush. It had become her signature move, her way of saying she could touch my property whenever she wanted, and I could not do anything about it. I took the brush and the letter inside, photographed both, and added them to my complaint file. Then I sat down and wrote an email to every homeowner in Canyon Ridge Commons whose address I could find in the neighborhood directory. The email was short. I explained what Carol had been doing, attached the photos of the backdated letter and the blocked driveway, and told everyone they could request the board meeting minutes themselves to see that the event setup rule had never been voted on. I sent the email at 11 at night and went to bed expecting silence. By morning, I had 43 replies. Most of them were from people who had their own stories about Carol. One woman said Carol had fined her for hanging a wreath on her mailbox. Another man said Carol had threatened to tow his boat trailer even though it was parked in his own driveway. A third person said Carol had been using the enforcement process to retaliate against anyone who questioned the HOA finances, and that 2 families had already moved out because they could not afford to keep fighting. The pattern was clear. Carol was not enforcing rules. She was using rules to punish anyone who challenged her authority. I forwarded the whole email chain to the State Consumer Protection Office and copied the news tip line staffer. Then I called the management company again and asked to speak to Greg's supervisor. Her name was Diane, and she sounded like someone who had heard this story before. "I have reviewed your file," Diane said. "The fines Carol issued do not match the board's standard enforcement procedure. I am going to send someone out to inspect the property and the driveway situation in person. Can you be available tomorrow afternoon?" "I can be available any time," I said. "Good," Diane said. "I will have someone there at 2. The supervisor visit happened exactly on schedule. A man in a reflective vest showed up at 2, walked the driveway, looked at the cones I had moved to the curb, and took his own photos. He asked me to explain the timeline, and I walked him through the whole thing: the folding table, the backdated letter, the records denial, the blocked driveway, the snow brush on the windshield. He listened without interrupting, made notes on a tablet, and then asked to see the board meeting minutes. I showed him the binder pages on my phone. He zoomed in on the dates, scrolled through the photos, and then looked up at me with an expression I could not quite read. "This is out of line," he said. "Carol does not have the authority to issue fines without a board vote on the underlying rule interpretation. I am going to recommend the management company suspend all active fines pending a full board review." "What happens to the money she already wants me to pay?" I asked. "If the board does not vote to uphold the fines, they get voided," he said. "You would not owe anything." He left a few minutes later, and I felt a small flicker of hope for the first time in 2 weeks. But hope does not last long when you are dealing with someone like Carol Rutherford. That evening, I got a text from Paul, the neighbor who had lent me the meeting minutes. He was still out of town, but someone had told him Carol was asking around about who had accessed his garage. Paul said he did not care, but he wanted me to know Carol was trying to figure out how I had gotten the records. The next morning, I found out why. Carol had filed a police report claiming I had trespassed in Paul's garage without permission. The officer who called me sounded bored and skeptical, but he said he had to follow up on the report. I explained that Paul had given me his garage code and permission to take the binder, and the officer said he would note that in his report and close the complaint. But the message was clear. Carol was not backing down. She was escalating again, and this time she was trying to make me look like a criminal. I called the news tip line staffer and told him what had happened. He said it was retaliation and that I should document every contact with the police in case Carol tried to use the report against me later. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "She is going to come at you harder now," he said. "She knows you have the minutes, and she knows the management company is reviewing the fines. She is going to try to bury you before the board meeting." He was right. 2 days later, the board meeting got moved up. Greg called and said the meeting was now scheduled for the following Monday, a week earlier than the original date, and that Carol had requested a closed executive session to discuss enforcement issues. I asked if I could attend the executive session. Greg said no. I asked if I could at least submit a written statement. He said I could, but it had to be submitted by Friday. I spent Thursday night writing a statement that laid out every piece of evidence I had. The backdated letter, the blocked driveway, the records denial, the retaliatory police report, the meeting minutes showing no vote on the event setup rule. I attached photos of everything, formatted the whole document like a legal brief, and submitted it to the management company on Friday morning. Then I waited. Monday came, and I was not allowed into the executive session, but I sat in the clubhouse lobby while the board met behind closed doors. I could hear Carol's voice through the wall, loud and insistent, but I could not make out the words. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. When the board members finally came out, Carol looked like she had been chewing glass. Greg walked over to me and handed me a printed letter. "The board has voted to void all fines related to the folding table incident," he said. "The event setup rule interpretation has been tabled for further review, and the management company has been instructed to provide you with the requested records at no charge." I looked at the letter. It was signed by the board president, not Carol. I looked back at Greg. "What about the retaliatory enforcement?" I asked. "The board has noted your concerns," Greg said. "That is all I can tell you right now." I walked out of the clubhouse feeling like I had won something, but I could not shake the feeling that Carol was not done. And I was right. That night, she sent me an email. It was short, just 2 sentences. "You cannot prove anything. I have been on this board for years. I know what I am doing." It was the same line she had used at the folding table, word for word. And just like before, it was about to come back and bite her. The State Consumer Protection Office called me 3 days later. The investigator said they had received my complaint and the follow-up emails from other homeowners. She said the pattern of retaliatory enforcement and records denial was enough to open a formal investigation into Canyon Ridge Commons Association. She asked if I had any additional evidence, and I told her about the email Carol had sent. She asked me to forward it. I did. Then she said something that made everything click into place. "We have received complaints about this HOA before," she said. "This is not the first time Carol Rutherford has been named in a retaliation case." That was the twist. Carol had not just been abusing her authority in my case, she had been doing it for years, using the enforcement process to retaliate against anyone who questioned the HOA finances or challenged her decisions. The state had a file on her. Other families had already filed complaints. I was not the first victim. I was just the first one who had pushed back hard enough to trigger a real investigation. The investigator told me the state would be conducting a compliance audit of Canyon Ridge Commons, and that all enforcement actions would be frozen until the audit was complete. She also said I should expect contact from the board's attorney, because the HOA was likely going to try to settle before the audit findings went public. The attorney called me the next day. He was polite, professional, and very clear about what the board was offering. They would refund all fines, issue a formal apology, and agree to a consent order banning retaliatory enforcement for the next 3 years. In exchange, I would drop my complaint with the state and sign a non-disparagement agreement. I told him I would think about it and call him back. I did not think about it for long. I called the news tip line staffer and asked him what he thought. He said the consent order was good, but the non-disparagement agreement was garbage. He said I should counter with a settlement that included the refunds and the consent order, but no gag clause. He also said I should ask for the HOA to pay my attorney fees, even though I had not hired an attorney yet. I called the HOA attorney back and told him my counter. He said he would run it past the board and get back to me. 2 days later, he called and said the board had accepted the terms. The settlement was done. I would get my money back, the retaliatory enforcement would stop, and I would not have to sign away my right to talk about what had happened. But I still had one move left, and it was the one Carol never saw coming. The state complaint confirmation I had been holding back, the document showing that the Consumer Protection Office had already received multiple complaints about Canyon Ridge Commons and Carol Rutherford specifically, was my trump card. I had not mentioned it to the board or the attorney during the settlement talks, because I wanted to use it at the right moment. And the right moment was coming. The fire marshal inspection happened the following week. Someone, I never found out who, had called in a complaint about the fire lane access beside the clubhouse. The marshal showed up on a Tuesday morning, walked the whole lane, and found it blocked by the same orange traffic cones Carol had used to trap my driveway. Apparently, she had been using the cones to reserve parking spots for board members, and the fire lane had been obstructed for weeks. The marshal issued a citation on the spot and told the management company the lane had to be cleared within 24 hours, or the HOA would face daily fines from the county. I was standing in the parking lot when it happened, and I saw the whole thing. Carol came out of the clubhouse mid-inspection, saw the marshal taking photos of the cones, and started arguing with him. She told him the cones were safety equipment. He told her the cones were a fire code violation. She told him she had been on the board for years and she knew what she was doing. He told her he did not care, and that if the lane was not cleared by the next morning, the county would do it for her and send her the bill. That was when I pulled out my phone and sent the state complaint confirmation to the entire board and every homeowner whose email I had. The document showed that the Consumer Protection Office had received complaints about Carol dating back 3 years, and that the current investigation was part of a pattern of enforcement abuse. I sent it to everyone at the same time so nobody could bury it, and I copied the management company and the HOA attorney. The subject line was simple. You cannot prove anything. It was Carol's own line, thrown back at her with the proof she said did not exist. Within an hour, I had replies from 6 board members, including the president. 2 of them said they had not known about the prior complaints. 3 said they wanted an emergency meeting to discuss Carol's role on the board. 1 said Carol should resign immediately. Carol did not resign, but she did not show up to the next board meeting either. Greg called me the day before the meeting and said Carol had taken a leave of absence for personal reasons and that the board was appointing an interim vice president. He also said the management company was conducting its own internal review of all enforcement actions Carol had issued in the last year, and that any homeowner who felt they had been unfairly fined could request a refund. The meeting itself was quiet. The board voted to approve the settlement terms, issued a formal apology to me and the other homeowners who had been targeted, and agreed to hire an independent compliance monitor to review all future enforcement actions. The consent order banning retaliatory enforcement was entered into the record, and the board president read a statement saying the HOA was committed to fair and transparent governance going forward. I did not say anything during the meeting. I just sat in the back row, listened, and watched the board members avoid looking at the empty chair where Carol used to sit. When the meeting ended, the president walked over and shook my hand. He said he was sorry for what I had gone through, and that the board was going to make sure it did not happen again. I thanked him and left. The settlement check arrived 2 weeks later. It covered all the fines Carol had issued, plus the records request fees, plus a small additional amount for what the attorney called goodwill compensation. I deposited the check the same day and moved the money into my down payment savings account. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to get me back on track. Canyon Ridge Commons did not turn into a paradise after Carol left. The HOA still argued about dock assignments and sightlines, and the management company still sent out notices about mailbox paint and holiday decorations. But the retaliatory enforcement stopped. The bogus fines stopped. The blocked driveways and the weaponized snow brushes stopped. And every time I walked past the clubhouse and saw the fire lane clear and empty, I thought about the folding table that started it all. I set the table up again the next time it snowed. Same spot, same thermos, same paper cups. Nobody said a word. A few neighbors stopped by for cocoa. One of them asked if I was worried about getting another fine. I told him I was not worried at all. The rules had not changed, but the people enforcing them had. And that made all the difference. Paul came back from Ohio a few days after the settlement closed, and I returned his binder of meeting minutes. He said he had heard about everything that happened, and he thanked me for finally standing up to Carol. He also said 3 other families were filing their own complaints with the state, using my case as a template. I told him I hoped it helped. He said it already had. The news tipline staffer called me a week later and said his station was running a story about HOA enforcement abuses in Indiana and that my case was going to be part of it. He asked if I wanted to be interviewed on camera. I said no. He said he understood, but that he was going to use the documents I had sent him as background for the story. I told him that was fine. The story ran the following Monday, and it did not mention my name, but it mentioned Canyon Ridge Commons and Carol Rutherford. The station got 43 calls from other homeowners and other associations with similar stories. The State Consumer Protection Office announced they were expanding the investigation to include 10 additional HOAs across the region. Carol never came back to the board. She resigned officially 2 months later, citing health reasons. The board replaced her with a retired teacher who had no interest in dock politics and no history of retaliatory enforcement. The new vice president's first act was to propose a rule change that required all fines to be approved by a majority board vote before they could be issued. The change passed unanimously. I stayed in Canyon Ridge Commons for another 8 months, saving every dollar I could. When I finally had enough for a down payment, I started looking at houses outside the HOA zone. I found a place in Noblesville, 20 minutes north, with no association and no rules about folding tables or snow brushes. I closed on the house in early fall, just before the next winter hit. On my last day in Canyon Ridge, I walked past the clubhouse one more time and looked at the fire lane. It was still clear. The cones were gone. The lane was open. I thought about Carol, wherever she was, and wondered if she ever realized that her own words had been the thing that brought her down. You cannot prove anything. She had said it twice, once at the folding table and once in the email, and both times it had been a lie. The proof was always there. It just took someone willing to dig it out and use it. I moved into my new place on a Saturday. No HOA, no board meetings, no Carol Rutherford. Just a driveway I could park in, a mailbox I could decorate, and a yard where I could set up as many folding tables as I wanted. I set one up that first weekend, filled a thermos with cocoa, and invited my new neighbors over. Nobody asked if I had submitted a request form. Nobody took photos. Nobody threatened me with fines. We just stood around in the snow, drinking cocoa and talking about the weather, and it felt like the most normal thing in the world. That was 6 months ago. I still work as a rideshare fleet coordinator, still schedule drivers and vehicles all day, and I still check the forecast every time a winter storm rolls in. But I do not worry about HOA letters anymore. I do not worry about backdated deadlines or blocked driveways or snow brushes used as weapons. I just shovel my driveway, drink my cocoa, and remember that documentation beats power trips every single time. The state investigation into Canyon Ridge Commons concluded 4 months after I moved out. The Consumer Protection Office found that Carol had issued over 200 enforcement actions in 3 years, and that more than half of them had been retaliatory or based on rule interpretations that were never approved by the board. The HOA was fined $12,000 and required to refund every affected homeowner. Carol was banned from serving on any HOA board in Indiana for 5 years. The management company that had enabled her was dropped, and a new company was hired with a mandate to enforce only board-approved rules. Paul texted me when the findings came out. He said the neighborhood felt different now, quieter, less paranoid. He said people were actually talking to each other again instead of just watching for violations. He said it felt like a real community for the first time in years. I told him I was glad, and I meant it. I do not go back to Canyon Ridge Commons anymore. I do not need to. But every time I see a folding table at a yard sale or a hardware store, I think about that morning in the parking lot, standing next to a thermos of cocoa while Carol Rutherford took photos like I had committed a crime. And I think about how a 2-foot wide card table became the thing that finally broke a system built on fear and retaliation. The snow is falling outside my window right now. I can see it piling up on the driveway, soft and clean and quiet. In a few hours, I will go out and shovel, and maybe I will set up the table again, just because I can. No deadlines, no fines, no backdated letters. Just cocoa, and snow, and the simple freedom of knowing that nobody can take it away.